Inspirational personalities have achieved more than most. But we forget they are normal people, just like us. So we want to learn about the way they think, to understand how they have achieved greatness.
Welcome. Today's guest is Cigall Kadoch, who is an associate professor of pediatric oncology at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and Howard Medical School. She's an epigenomics program co-director at the Broad Institute of Harvard and MIT, and an investigator at the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. After completing her PhD, focusing on chromatin remodeling with Gerald Crabtree at Stanford, she moved directly into a faculty position at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, establishing her own independent research group. In 2016, she founded Foghorn Therapeutics, which launched on the NASDAQ in 2020. She has been recognized in the Forbes 30 Under 30 Popular Science Brilliant 10 and has several accolades, including Outstanding Achievement in Basic Cancer Research from the AACR and the AAAS Martin and Rose Wachtel Cancer Research Prize. Thank you for coming and welcome to Encounters.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So before we dive into the question, maybe you want to tell us a bit about yourself in your own words. So where you come from, where you grew up.
Sure. So I grew up in California on the West Coast before I moved ultimately to the East Coast. Grew up with my two loving parents and my younger sister, who's actually also in biotech. My parents are interior decorators, so I like to think that I got perhaps one fraction of their brilliant creativity to apply it to science, and lived my whole life on the West Coast before transitioning to the East Coast to begin my academic career.
Okay, amazing. So obviously you achieved quite a lot in a fairly short time. Are you most proud of any of your achievements so far?
I think if I were to reflect on what I'm most proud of being able to assemble a group of highly diverse, talented, kind individuals to work in my research lab. I think it's the products really of this diversity that have given rise to some of our most exciting discoveries.
What about in the non-scientific field, in your personal life, in the non-academic sphere, anything you're particularly proud of, achievements?
I'm most proud of my family. I'm most proud of having moved to Boston, found a wonderful husband, and now raising two children is definitely the light of my life.
Just quickly on your family, with two interior decorator parents, you and your sister both ending up in biotech. That's fascinating. How do you think that happened?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So growing up, my parents nurtured our interests in science and math. I think they themselves have always had this innate curiosity about the world and really encouraged us to understand nature, understand the human body. And I think both of us were seeking to really understand how things worked, particularly how the human body worked. And I think that led us to pursue science and biomedical science. And my sister's actually on the business side of science, ultimately. I think that contributed. In addition, we also had a caretaker, a nanny, if you will, who spent a lot of time with us when we were young and further inspired our interest in nature. And actually, when we were just young girls, she was diagnosed, unfortunately, with metastatic breast cancer and ultimately succumbed to disease in about just a short period of 3 months. And my sister and I were completely devastated. And for me, it was actually that moment that catalyzed my thinking that perhaps I would ultimately try to do something about cancer and try to dedicate my research efforts to cancer. And actually here I am today, still doing that.
So you've spoken a bit about your motivations, and your career progression has obviously been fairly unusual. It's much accelerated compared to other people who go through a similar kind of progression. So I was wondering, was it all planned, or have you kind of just taken things as they've been offered to you and worked your way up that way?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I actually started out this whole work in science thinking that I would become a medical doctor. I was intent on becoming an oncologist. I was intent on going to medical school. That was for sure my goal after college. And it was during college that I first got my first taste in the lab. And I realized that I loved it. I became addicted to trying to discover new things, completely fascinated by the emerging approaches we as a scientific field had to ask and then answer challenging biological questions. And it became clear that I couldn't let that go. And so actually, even at the moment of deciding, will I apply to medical school, will I apply to graduate school, perhaps a combination thereof, I decided and elected to pursue a PhD first, with the idea that even after that PhD, I would go back into medical school. And then toward the end of the PhD, it was a very exciting PhD, and we had essentially characterized and discovered a new realm of the science that our lab now today studies. And so once again, faced with this question, would I become a medical doctor? Would I pursue the goal that I had initially? I decided I would not, and I would continue pushing forward with the science. And it was that moment in time, actually, that enabled this career to be a bit accelerated. It was not intentional. I did not intend to skip a postdoc. I did not intend to cut any training short. I had only had about 2.5 years of graduate training altogether, so I wasn't very well trained, if you think about it. I had very limited training. And when the moment came about to think about starting a lab on the heels of some of these very exciting discoveries, and with a little help, I think, from the timing of the field, just given that in this moment, it was at the time where there was this surge of sequencing studies worldwide that had been done. And these sequencing studies repeatedly revealed frequent mutations in the very regulators and the very factors that we study, these large molecular machines that lay in the nuclei of every single one of our trillions of cells. So it was the first time that these were so intimately linked to human disease, cancer, immune conditions, neurologic conditions, and so on. And it was this moment in time that I was either going to push forward or stop and change my career path. And it made, sense to really push forward with this, to be able to drive these discoveries, hopefully to new therapeutics for patients, which is what our lab and ultimately company has also done.
So basically you're saying that kind of realizing the potential of your PhD work or your research, was that kind of like the factor which then drove you to immediately apply to a faculty position rather than pursuing a postdoc maybe in a different field? Or
yes, it was rather unexpected. I remember having conversations with Jerry, telling him that I was going to gear up to apply to medical school and I was going to pursue my original goal. And I remember in one conversation, he just put down his paper, looked at me and said, "You can't do that. You can't stop doing science. You have to keep going on this. This is incredible work." And I myself also recognized that this was a unique moment in time. There are few moments, and I think any scientist would say there are a few defining moments that really one can look back and say, this was a moment in time that changed our scientific trajectory, changed my career, changed our thinking in the field. And this was all three of those. And so I, made the decision that I would pursue science. But again, I had just finished graduate school. The next step was to do a postdoc for sure. And I remember actually going around and getting advice about where I should do this postdoc, because as you all know, one of the top pieces of advice you get for postdoc is do something different. Go succeed again in something completely different. That's the typical, piece of advice that we all give our trainees. That's the advice that I had heard. And then I just thought to myself, there's nothing I'd rather less do. I don't want to leave this field. This field was just in its infancy. It was the first time in the world these chromatin remodelers had really been so tightly linked to disease. There were a plethora of opportunities for therapeutic discovery. It was not the kind of moment one would say, okay, I'm going to leave that here. I'm going to park it and I'm going to go do something totally different. For me, all I wanted to do was continue it. And for postdoctoral opportunities, there actually weren't many where I could just continue it. I remember sitting with Jerry and saying, Jerry, I don't really care about my title. I don't care how long it takes me to finish my training. I just want to keep pushing on this. And so he said, sure, you can stay in the lab. You can go do something. Maybe we can do a joint postdoc somewhere. And it was actually because of that thought I was going to go to Boston, and I gave a lecture at the Broad Institute, where Stuart Schreiber, Jerry's longtime colleague and friend, was there with his lab. And I delivered a talk, a simple talk. I hadn't even actually defended my PhD thesis, so I was still not even a graduate with a PhD from Stanford. I gave this lecture, not knowing what would happen from this lecture. And it just happened to be that the very chairman who ultimately hired me at Dana-Farber and Harvard Medical School had come to that talk and just said, listen, we have an open search. You should come back a week later, come back to Boston, interview for that. I did. I won that search and was able to get this position. I think, thinking back on it, I think the many faculty who attended that talk and who ultimately invited me to give this lecture for competing for a faculty position likely had more faith in me than I had in myself, because I only had 2.5 years of training. I was being called a biochemist, but really I was still learning biochemistry, I thought. I had made some exciting discoveries, yes, but I felt I still had quite a lot to learn. And so it was this moment in time where I had to think, can I do this? Can I really jump to independence and run a research laboratory? And I think with the support of my many mentors, my new to-be mentors at Harvard, and of course, friends and family, I made the decision that I'm going to give this a go, and I'm just going to pour my heart into it and see what happens. Because what's the worst that can happen? Perhaps I wouldn't be good at it. Perhaps I wouldn't be a good laboratory leader. Perhaps I wouldn't know how to be an effective mentor being just 27 years old myself and not having had much training. Perhaps the science wouldn't go as I would hope or plan. But excitingly, with a PhD and with this kind of training and work in the field, there are many exciting jobs in the biomedical science. So I just thought I would give this a go, do the very best I can, and see what happens. And here I am still today in my same position and enjoying it so much.
Well, this is exactly what I wanted to ask you about. Even if you're sure that you're at some kind of scientific inflection point and that what you're working on needs to be worked on, having the confidence personally to then step up without having done a postdoc and take a faculty position is something that I think very few PhD students have the confidence to do. So it was people around you that were helping to convince you that it was something that you could do.
Yes, and for me also, it's important to remember I had never even left my home, really. I grew up in the Bay Area. I went to the University of California, Berkeley for undergraduate. I did research at UCSF. I did my PhD at Stanford. These are really just doing triangles around our San Francisco Bay Area. I had never left, within a, 40-minute distance to my parents' house. I still am incredibly close to my parents and sister, and all my friends I had made throughout my entire childhood and college and graduate school. So I had never lived on the East Coast. And to make not only the transition to an entirely new job at an age during which the people I would hire for my lab would be my age or older, I was going to do that, but also I hadn't ever lived on the East Coast. I didn't really have any ties here, and I didn't have, too many friends as of, when I moved. So this was a very new set of opportunities for me. And, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't nervous about it. And I wasn't, there are times where I lacked confidence for sure. But I think the summation really of all the people in my life encouraging me to take this opportunity and make the most of it and see what can blossom from this science and from this opportunity. And importantly, the new intellectual adjacencies around me was something I couldn't surpass.
And was the support fairly ubiquitous, or did you come against some people who thought that it was crazy that you would try to go straight to a faculty position?
I think the large majority were incredibly supportive, and I think they knew what they were getting into hiring me. They knew my training, and I think they were very supportive. Of course, there were, I'm sure, several in the field that just thought, "What is she doing? How is she going to make it? She has no training. She's running a lab at Harvard. How is she ever going to get students and postdocs to join her rank? Is that going to be possible? How am I going to get grants? How am I going to support the research enterprise that I'm trying to run?" I remember early on some faculty mentors, as they saw the lab, as they would pass by my lab every so often, they was seeing that the lab was growing in size. And I was very excited about that. I suddenly had, not just myself doing late night PCR, but it was more some students and some postdocs joining my ranks and wanting to contribute to what I thought was this exciting new area of science. And at one point they just said, "What are you doing? You have 7 people and you've only been here 3 months. How can you be doing that? You're already out of space. You're going to ruin your career. You can't possibly mentor that. You can't grow that quickly. You can't mentor that many people." But it was actually that moment that I felt I actually had established a lab, because it was the first moment where those first, 7 or so people made it feel like a family. It was the first time where I wasn't the only one they were coming to for questions, whether it was, technical questions about the science, conceptual questions, career questions, but really each other.
It was a bit more sustainable.
Right. It was the first time I felt that they were always going to come to me with the question. Instead, they were going to come to one another and ask questions about how they can advance their projects. They were asking each other for their valuable opinions. They valued one another. And this is, I think, back to what I was saying about the value of creating a laboratory environment that embodies a collection of different skills, perhaps different levels, different thinking, and a diversity that is beneficial to driving new science and challenging science forward.
And one more quick question before we move on. Was there ever a point where you felt really overwhelmed, where you were trying to set up a lab, trying to manage things, and you thought, I've made a big mistake here, or you felt out of your depth?
I think in the very, very beginning, I moved on a cold Boston evening, Boston winter, arriving late with my suitcases in the snow. And I just thought, what in the world have I done? I barely own socks, living in California where you don't really need socks. Moving here to a freezing cold. Actually, it was the worst winter on record for Boston. And that was exactly the first winter I was in Boston. So finding it challenging even to navigate the city in these terrible storms. But also the storm was really, I think, a reflection of also what I thought was going on in terms of how hard it was and the challenges to build a research lab. Yes, and I think one of the other challenges, and I think I've told many people this, both training with me and just as career advice, it's very challenging, I think. I think one uses really different, distinct hemispheres of the brain, thinking about your technical experiments that you're doing at the bench versus the larger conceptual picture and writing grants and writing papers that are going to captivate a wide audience. And I think they're each very important but independent skill sets. Of course, they're intertwined, but for me at least, they required complete thinking on one or complete thinking on the other. And I remember moving to Boston and thinking, I have to push forward these experiments because I was still one of the only members of the lab being able to drive forward the work at the bench. But then I also have to fund this lab somehow. And I'm going to have to prove to everybody that I can actually, get grants and get support for our lab, write papers, have things actually emerge from our research group would be a nice thing. And I just found that very hard. That was the one time where I felt in the very beginning, I was trying to do experiments, teach experiments, come back after the day was done and after the folks in the lab had gone home, continue my own experiments because I never got a chance to do that. But I remember it actually set me at a good, ground zero in the sense that I realized that the metric we all have for our success as a PhD student or a postdoc in the lab, the metric for your success is how much you got done that day. How many new experiments did you do? What data did you analyze? How cool is the finding you have? But when you transition to becoming a lab leader, it's not all about you anymore. It's not all about your success that day. It's about the success of the people in your research group and how much can you amplify their successes and your efforts and your concepts that you want to push forward. And so I had to start to change my framework of thinking a little bit and think, well, I didn't get my set of experiments done today, but I did advance the experiments of 5 other people to help them push forward. And it would just require added hours at night to be able to then take a break from all of that and then do the writing and think about the lab in a more holistic way.
And did you find that transition easy, or because some scientists much prefer doing the experiments and being at the bench and find that they're not so well suited to the people managing, the media, the grant funding generating, but did you feel that you were equally suited to both, or did you even prefer maybe moving into a more...
Yeah, I think at heart, I think I am a real tinkerer. I really liked doing experiments. I liked the hands-on work a lot. And I actually had a very hard time letting that go. I had to ultimately let that go because I was out of space. I was taking this, if I were to stay in the lab, having a bench, I would actually take the space of somebody else who could come and join our group. So I ultimately did transition, and I've loved my, role as a lab leader now. And of course, having a more conceptual role and in the writing and in the thinking and in the guidance. I love this, job. I wouldn't have it any other way. But certainly at that moment, because I so love the experiments themselves and get a real thrill, I think, out of getting results each day, it was actually hard for me to put down.
Creeping in at night just to get one final little experiment.
Yes, I remember actually there was a point where one new student in my lab saw me in the lab very, very late, and he was like, look at this. This is the only time you're now allowed to do experiments in the lab. We've all kicked you out. You're now running the lab, and we've taken over all these benches, but you still can't get enough. You have to come back and do an experiment. So I haven't done an experiment myself in quite some time now, but I have maintained the conceptual hands-on nature to still be able to guide, of course, the experiments and hopefully offer some valuable technical advice when needed at times.
So let's shift gears a bit, tiny bit.
Sure.
You already touched on this. You said you find it quite exciting when lab members in your lab flourish. I kind of want to ask you, do you feel like you're a very driven person? Because you also said I feel like I have a good project here. I feel like I can drive it to really make an impact. And then maybe what drives you? Is that like in your own words, define it?
Sure. So I think in terms of driving forward projects, I think one of the best skills I've tried to learn over the years in running a lab is how to place individuals where they're best fit and where they're most excited. Because we all have a choice of the projects that we run in labs. And I try to present several potential options, have several discussions about the concepts that we can try to pursue. There are many meaningful questions, all with important therapeutic relevance that we can pursue in the lab. But I usually try to wait until I can really sense that inner passion from somebody else that's about to work on a project and really sense that they're going to be so excited to drive that forward. Because in a lab environment, it can't be me only driving this project forward. It's definitely, number one, and first and foremost, it's the student or the postdoc that is going to drive forward that project and try to maximize its outcome. So I think in terms of defining drive, of course, everyone in our group, I would say, is driven. I think we're all collectively driven to make a difference in the world. That's the type of people that we get in our lab. And the best thing I can do, therefore, to maximize that to the highest level is to ensure that each person is played where they're best fit. For example, on a team, of course, you don't play your wide receiver to your tackler. You don't play your defensive lineman to your wide receiver. You really need to have that thought process about where to place them, where to help them help them place themselves to make sure that they can be maximized in their work.
And for our British audience, defender and attacker,
Yeah.
you don't swap positions, but
Yes,
basically.
exactly.
Generally though, so you're saying basically the project or the science is the thing which drives you and which you want your lab members to be driven by. But do you think there are any other factors as well?
For instance, you mentioned your caretaker earlier.
Yeah.
I think a combination of both personal and then more academic questions and experiences have grounded our work in cancer research in particular. On a personal side, as I mentioned, in addition to my caretaker, we've of course all experienced, I think, family members or friends with cancer, either a diagnosis or unfortunately a death from cancer. This is something that afflicts many of us. So, it's hard to ignore that major biomedical problem, crisis, if you will, for the world. I also, as I was thinking about where to accept this faculty position, it became very clear that working at a place like Dana-Farber, this is a cancer hospital within the Harvard Medical School community. And, I can't walk up to my office a single day without passing through and seeing cancer patients, both adults and children with cancer, their parents, their friends, their families with them. That's a very stark reminder of the importance of human health and the importance of what we're doing. And I don't think there's a better driver out there for the work that we are trying to pursue. It's, of course, as a scientist, you all know, it's easy to perhaps, quote, have a bad day and have your experiment not work and fail. But I always tell everyone in my lab, if you need a reminder of why you're here, and if you need a way to quickly, scrap that experiment and start over again and do it right, just walk downstairs. All you have to do is walk downstairs and see the number of cancer patients that have come to us from all over the world for cancer treatment, for a second opinion, to engage in our research discussions. And I think there's nothing more inspiring than that.
Do you feel that puts a bit of pressure on you as well, in a way?
Yes, I think the pressure is a positive pressure in the sense that there's clear urgency. There's urgency because we know the numbers. We know the numbers of the number of people passing away of cancer per day. It's right in front of our face when we have to go to work each day at the Dana-Farber. The urgency is clear. There is a series of unmet medical needs that haven't been able to be successfully overcome. And we're tirelessly dedicating our efforts to try to push those boundaries out of the way. The boundaries are, sometimes seemingly endless in the sense that there are a number of patients with a number of different backgrounds to their cancers. There's different genetic basis for cancer. There are different treatment successes and failures. And want us to take this culmination of all that knowledge when thinking about how are we going to scientifically have the basis to interdict across all of those different cancer types. The sequencing era has unveiled the fact that there are way more types of cancers arising from way more genetic lesions than we ever would have imagined. In one way, that presents a series of new opportunities to actually get it right, to understand the ground zero and pursue the types of research that would be best fit for that type of cancer. On another side, that's a daunting task to know that there are that many and that deep dive research efforts are needed on each one of those to really, positively make an impact.
Is that kind of like, to make that impact, was that something which played into the decision of you starting a spin-out company, basically, about your research to kind of have a bit more of an immediate impact, or were there any other driving factors behind that decision?
Yes, it's a great question. As I, started the laboratory, it became very clear as we had our first, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people in the lab. With each project that we had, it became clear that with every new mechanism we had uncovered, we were also uncovering a potential accompanying therapeutic opportunity. But in the lab, we're biochemists, we're increasingly biophysicists and structural biologists. We layer in epigenomics, genetics, and even systems biology to really take a full series of opportunities to explore these problems. But we're not chemists, and we're certainly not medicinal chemists. And even if we were, the amount of capital-intensive work, also with clear ways of pursuing drug discovery efforts that we don't have the capabilities for in our laboratory, that are really needed to drive forward true drug discovery, is way more than what I can do in my individual lab. And I recognized that very early on. Right up front, we realized that if we were going to try to take every single one of these mechanisms and now drug them too by running screens and generating 600 analogs to every lead compound we generate, we just don't have the capital or the resourcing to be able to do that. Even in the best of funding circumstances, that's a very challenging tall order. So it was at that moment, almost right in step with starting the lab, I decided to start the company as well, because we knew that, first of all, this biology was hard. Each new project in the lab was very hard. It took us a while to get off the ground. We knew that this was a new area that actually we needed almost several steps backwards before we could push forward a new field of therapeutics, a new field of understanding. And I reasoned that it would be the best intellectual effort for all of us to really invest the time and do that properly, to set the field in the right framework, the right foundation to be able to pursue therapeutic discovery in the most relevant way. And so to do that, we would need all our efforts on that biology. And similarly, we would need to generate and create a group for which their efforts were entirely focused on taking those mechanistic underpinnings and translating them forward with their own drug discovery efforts. And so it was with that notion that I started Foghorn. I elected to start a startup company. It was also for this reason that we decided not to push forward drug discovery just in collaboration with large pharma, because we could have done that. There were many opportunities, and large pharma, of course, plays a huge role in driving forward major drug discovery efforts. There were many opportunities, but again, we reasoned just based on the challenging nature of this new biology, which hadn't really even been a topic in the field of chromatin regulation for the majority of time until this pivotal moment where all the sequencing studies and everybody thought this was the most important regulator. It is the most frequently mutated. These mammalian switch-NIF chromatin remodeling complexes that we study are the most frequently perturbed cellular entities, second only to p53 in cancer. So this just shows how much work we had to do to try to understand them and and how many patients this could affect if we did understand them and we did make effective therapeutics. So I didn't want any delay in that. Again, the urgency is felt when you work at Dana-Farber. The urgency is felt in a big way. I didn't want to delay. I wanted to build a group of people entirely dedicated to just this biology. In large pharma, as you may know, each lead investigator, each group leader, certainly each VP and heads of research, they have multiple projects they have to focus on at a given time. This needed its own level of focus, and that was my reasoning for starting a smaller startup company, Foghorn Therapeutics, which, as you mentioned, is now public and now over 150 employees and is growing and is now in the clinic.
So you moved directly from a PhD into a faculty position, started your lab at a new place, and then decided, you know what, why not start a company simultaneously as well? Is there any, did you feel overwhelmed with that as well? Or how did you manage it, basically? How did you separate maybe your time into making sure that all of these things kind of worked out?
Well, I'd be lying if I said it wasn't a very, very busy time, perhaps the busiest time of my entire young career, because I didn't actually come into this position thinking, okay, I'm going to start the lab and start a company. Okay. I didn't think that. I only became clear within a few months of having the lab that we weren't going to be able to do it all just ourselves, but I could lead a second entity or help found a second entity to grow into its role in drug discovery in this field. And then we would be able to reach all our goals of trying to transition these discoveries, these new mechanisms into hopefully meaningful therapeutics for patients. I go back to my story of wanting to become a medical doctor from the very beginning. The reason I wanted that was because I wanted a chance to impact patient lives. I wanted to ensure that our basic science would cross that bridge. And I'm really, pleased and touched and happy that we are now at the very early stages, but we are now starting to understand what this biology may mean in patients suffering from very major diseases. It was an extremely busy time. People often ask about the starting of the company within just a few short months of starting the lab and trying to get all this up and going, with probably also the world again saying, is she going to be able to do it because she's so young, she doesn't have this training? And I just kept pushing forward, not really thinking about that much, not thinking about even the the output of our work. I knew we were going to have papers. I knew we were going to have grants, I hoped at some point. So I just kept pushing forward on all these fronts. And in terms of starting the company, of course, running the lab is already more than a full-time job. So to try to do that, I remember being set up to talk to various investors and venture capital and try to interview people to start joining the company at an early stage. And I would just put all of those breakfasts at, 7 a.m. And then I'd try to have a breakfast with an investor or a potential, new key position in the company at 7, make sure I was in my lab by 9, perhaps have a lunch that was centered around Foghorn, run the whole research day, and then at 5, maybe have drinks or dinner with other folks, again, surrounding the company so that I could maximize the time each day spent on both the lab and the company. And it went on like this for quite some time until the company was more up and running. I played a role in the hiring of the first many people who joined the company.
Did you get any help from your sister? You said she was a little bit more in the business side of biotech.
Yeah, it's a great question. She was at the time in San Francisco in a small biotech company focused on microbiome science. And she actually, our networks, excitingly, have really converged. It's really exciting. I didn't know at the time much about the business side or even the company side of this scientific enterprise. I was so focused on the lab and the academic science. So she actually brought several contacts my way. I've in turn passed several contacts her way in her career. And it's been rewarding, actually, many times now to go to a big conference, a big healthcare conference like JP Morgan, where all the big and small companies alike meet each year in San Francisco. And she and I would pass each other on the streets of San Francisco going to different meetings. And I think at that moment we told our parents, I think our worlds have really converged here from the business side of science to the academic sides of science. Here we are, we're invited to the same repertoire of parties at this large set of pharma and biotech gatherings. And, sometimes even the same meeting. So that was really special for us.
Yeah, that must be lovely getting to work with her.
Would you then say kind of like for individuals who kind of have an idea, want to start a company or are in an academic environment, besides getting all the investors to pay for breakfast, lunch and dinner, are you saying they should just go for it? Kind of like just have an attitude of like, let's go for it, let's try it. You mentioned before that when you started your lab, you were like, well, if it doesn't work out, then it doesn't work out. Do you think that's the right attitude to kind of get these things off the ground?
I think it's the right attitude. I think in general, if one has conviction that the idea is good and the timing is right, then yes, by all means. I think you need to go forward and start testing this idea on other groups of people. For me, those other groups of people were investors, venture capital firms. And I just took a very, quite frankly, relaxed approach. I didn't have any real pressure on me to have to start a company or anything. It was just that I thought it was the right time. Maybe I was going to be proven wrong if they say, no, I don't think it's the right time. But I just thought I would test the idea because, again, what do I have to lose? I sat down for several of these breakfasts and just explained the science, what we know at the moment, what we didn't still know, how this was going to be very early days if we did do a company because we were still learning about the science. I mean, if you think about it, the company is actually essentially done this waltz with the lab. The lab discovers something, the company takes it forward, discovers something, company forward, company, pushes forward the biology even more to be able to take it toward therapeutics. And we're just kind of constantly doing this dance of driving this very new area of biology forward. So it's been fun to see both sides of this really contribute to our overall understanding of the field. But I think in the end, it was the right time, the right place. There was a complete hole in the market. There were no companies focused on this area of biology, yet there were clear reasons to be focused on this biology. And we had made some of the early discoveries about how one would go about drug discovery efforts. So I thought it was the right time and place. But you also have to fill out the market. And the market is a different market now than it was in 2016. It'll be a different market in 5 years from now. And so I think one has to be thoughtful about where the world is, what's the mentality. We've gone through, of course, COVID, and during that time, there has never been a more fervent surge of biotech companies and investments in the life sciences ever. There are over 850 public biotech companies now. That's unbelievable. So many of those emerged during just the past 3-4 years. And I think, for COVID as one example, there's never been a more clear reminder of the importance of human health. And I think that's why investors from all different sectors essentially deemed it a good idea to come into biotech. There were all these investors that maybe hadn't spent much time in biotech before, now pouring their dollars into that. Now we're in a little bit of a different time. The market's swung down a little bit. Biotech is actually down as a sector altogether. There are a lot of those 850 companies are having trouble for this reason. And so again, one has to think a little bit about why that is. What's the market at the moment? Is it the right time? Is the idea new enough that it's not really being pursued by any other company? So I think it takes a little bit, because there's just more out there now, it takes a little bit more research. It's a little bit akin to the era of scientists before us that didn't really, have the internet and didn't use PubMed as much. They would have to run to the library to figure out, has this ever been done? Has this ever been tried? They have to know the field. Nowadays, you can do a very simple Google search and you'll know right away if your project has been tried or done. And I think it's a little bit of those changes in generation that happen, every 10, 15, 20 years or so, where there's a little bit of a different change, and one has to be aware of that as well.
So you're obviously very curious and you're obviously very driven. So I wonder, perhaps bracketing those, what do you think is your most distinctive personality trait?
I think it's pattern recognition. So we go to the lab every day, we push forward experiments, we learn some things. And at the end of the day, if you can think a little bit about it, you start to find repeating patterns that might be true. Repeating patterns and, of course, just how you do the experiment, what works and what doesn't work. And more importantly, perhaps, repeating patterns in the conceptual advances that you make. And if you think about biology, biology tends to use mechanisms in more than one place. If you discover an exciting mechanism, let's just say, in our case, in one rare cancer, sure, it might be just the mechanism of that one rare cancer, and it's unique, and that's how we pitched it. But as we took a step back and thought about that mechanism in that rare cancer, perhaps we can think, where else has biology gone wrong in that same way? What else can we learn from that one rare cancer that afflicts a very small number of patients? And can we take those learnings and apply them to a much greater collection of cancers or even human diseases altogether? And it was that pattern recognition and then pattern application, I think, that has had the biggest impact on our research group.
And what about, conversely, a trait that perhaps hasn't helped you so much in your career, just so that we can feel a little bit better about ourselves?
I think, the level of expectation of myself, of ourselves, and how far-reaching I want our work to be. I think we put this level of pressure, so probably pressure, the pressure we put on ourselves to ensure we make the maximal difference, not just scratch the surface, where sometimes it's tempting to just say, okay, well, I've gotten this far, so I'm going to stop. But really, we try to push ourselves to reach those limits and push the work to as high a place as possible. I think that's it's a blessing and a curse. We're just to be not satisfied. We're not satisfied even with a great big discovery. I take the view of, definitely the glass half full, and we take the view that we celebrate these good discoveries as a major, milestone. But it also opens the door for how much more there is to do to really take this forward. And that's true, I think, for, you think about every major discovery. You think about the Nobel Prize discovery, for example, of CRISPR. This was a major milestone in the field of biomedical research. It's changed all of our lives as scientists. But those scientists playing critical roles in the discovery of CRISPR couldn't themselves just stop there and say, wow, we've made a really important discovery. Now, of course, the challenge is getting this into patients and making sure this actually has a positive impact in, highly aggressive diseases. So similarly here, we've made a series of discoveries to characterize this previously almost entirely elusive family of chromatin remodeling complexes that are, replete and, throughout our cells and play critical roles in disease. But it's now up to us to figure out how are we going to design and develop the best therapeutic approaches to make a difference in the various diseases that have these implicated.
Are there any kind of besides, let's say, the academics or with your company, are there any other kind of milestones you want to hit, or any kind of achievements you might? Any
other hats you want to wear in addition to the 3, 4?
I think my other real goal is entirely personal. I want to be the best mother I possibly can to our children. I want to be the best wife. I want to ensure that my family life is as taken care of as possible and as happy as possible and as healthy as possible. So outside of the work that I do each day for the lab and for the company and all my various roles, I really want to pass all this knowledge and everything I can as a parent to my young children in the same way my parents did for me.
well, you kind of touched on the topic of success, right? You said that for you, in a way, success is like not necessarily that you personally are successful in a day. It's like if your lab is successful. I guess that probably goes also if your company reaches some sort of milestones. Is that the way you would define success now, as like kind of academic achievements, or is there a certain way you would say this is success for you?
I think to define success, of course, it has many meanings. I think to define success for me, it's the degree of impact that the discovery or that the work or that the teaching or that the mentorship, any aspect of that can have on people. On the science side, it's of course how wide-spanning is the discovery? How much does it change everybody in this world studying science? How much does it change the way we think about science? How much does it potentiate new roads forward for science and ultimately medicine? On the therapeutic side, how many patients can we reach? The success would be defined by the impact we've really had on people's lives, not patients' lives, people's and their families' lives. And in the lab, how many brilliant new scientists can we help raise and help reach their dreams and help reach their career goals going forward? As a mentor, we are scientists, of course, that's our inherent function, but we also, and I am a mentor and educator. That's really actually our primary role, is being a mentor and educator in addition to a scientist. And it's important, I think, to think about that role. It's a very, very important role. And so success is certainly measured by the outcome of the people who have been through our research group, been through our training programs. How much have they succeeded in their own minds? That's not my definition of success. It's their definition of success. How much have they reached their own goals? Because goals are tailored to the individual. How much have we helped potentiate those goals? Can we measure that? That's success for me, is when we've been able to see someone reach their potential, perhaps more than what they thought was their potential. That's really the best form of success. And carry forward to do the productive things that they were hoping to do in this world. That's the greatest thing that I can experience as a mentor and educator.
So if you would not be a scientist, you probably thought about this as well, right? In one way or the other, would you then be an educator, or would you maybe be a medic? Although that kind of touches on the topic of science as well in a way.
Yeah, if not in science and medicine, I think I would have pursued a career that allows both creativity and, again, this fine tinkering and trying to understand the world. I'm ever perplexed and inspired by music. I love classical music. I tried to train myself in classical piano, so I'm a self-taught classical pianist, but not a very good one anymore because I don't practice as much. But I think that was an outlet for me that I think embodies really creativity, organization, thinking, and actually even relates, I think, to science. When I was a graduate student, I had a chance to take 2 courses actually in introductory conducting. So I knew I wasn't going to be able to become a really masterful classical pianist, but I love music, and I love the idea that a conductor has this opportunity to coordinate the ultimate sound output of multiple different instruments and multiple different people, and learned a little bit about the philosophy of conducting, from a brilliant professor to talking about the conducting of many famous conductors throughout the world. And I think I can think of times where the lessons learned from that course actually helped me think about running my lab, thinking about building this company. It's really played into that. So perhaps I'd be a musician. I don't know.
It's funny, there's definitely a link there. We've had a few guests say that it's something to do with music. It's probably some kind of pattern recognition, something like that. So we're a fairly new series, Encounter. So today is actually the first time that we've had a prominent woman in science to talk to, which I find very exciting. So I wanted to know, do you feel like sex has impacted your journey in the scientific field?
I think I'll say a few things. I think, of course, we have a long way to go to enable and empower women to reach their full potential. I think this is, of course, complicated by the fact that we are indeed the child bearers. We do have to, go through this process, which is challenging. I've now done it twice myself, and I know can speak firsthand about those challenges. I think at the same time, while we have a long way to go as a field, as an industry, in enabling women and empowering them to reach their, full potential and career aspirations, I think we've also come a long way. And I think it's, in my career specifically, I think it's been an exciting time to grow up, if you will, as a scientist in an era in which there is prominent focus on women. And every institute in which I've had the opportunity to learn or to train or now to run a lab, there are numerous discussions about how can we do better to enable women. And I've grown up essentially in that era of thinking that. The generation before me less so, and the generation before me much less so. So I think while there's, again, a long way to go, I think we really have made significant strides toward support for women. That is encompassed in almost every academic institute and company philosophy. Just this year, we've seen changes even in the NIH, National Institute of Health, which is what we have in the United States, for grants to support women who are childbearing. And I think increasingly so, we're seeing that. We're seeing more and more support for women at this critical stage.
So I think one of the reasons why people find academic science particularly difficult, as you say, we've made a lot of progress in terms of lab environments, but it is that having to have children at an age where you are pushing to try and get papers out and try and get postdocs or to try and get professorships positions. So for you, that must have been actually quite different than it is for a lot of postdocs, considering you skipped that stage altogether. So how did that work for you? How did you juggle that?
So for me, it's a bit of a different situation because I was 5-6 years into my academic position when I had our first child, and now a few years later, having our second child. The first child, our first one, Ethan, was born right at the beginning of COVID. So literally I had shut down the lab. This was March 2020, had shut down the lab, and a week later we had our firstborn son and the lab was shut down. I had our first child at a time where my lab wasn't functioning. Just think about it. I had a long-standing anxiety about what I was going to do when we had our first child. I knew that I wanted to be the best mother I could be, but I also had a fully functioning 25-person lab that I needed to tend to and the company running at this point. And so I was always hard-pressed a little bit to think about what was going to happen when he arrived. We were so excited, but what was going to happen? How would I run all this? Of course, we had help, to help us with the little one. We had nannies, we had parents. But again, that's in my position in the sense of I was already a PI. So it comes with additional stress in the sense that now I have everybody requiring my attention because I'm leading the lab. But I've also witnessed at the exact same time as myself having, children, a student having children and a postdoc having children in my lab. And they're at very, very different times in their career. The postdoc, of course, deciding whether even to have a second child now or not, because she's wondering, is this a good time? I still don't have my job. I still have to go around and fly around to compete for faculty positions. I still haven't published my main paper. So I have these discussions with students and postdocs in my lab regularly because this is a very major difference compared to where I was when I had my children. And then the other one, an MD PhD student, right in between laboratory training and again, going back to the clinic, of course, experiencing some delays there, trying to time it right, but you can't, biology doesn't work that way. You can't always time it perfectly, and so on and so forth. So I've had, I think, very meaningful discussions with women of all stages of their career having children. It wasn't only women, it was also men in the lab with their wives having children at the same time and trying to balance that family role and being sure that they're an active father who's active and there for his children. So I've seen it in all ways. And yes, the timing is just a little bit different in my case. And I think there's challenges on all sides. The biggest challenge, of course, for trainees is just that financially at that moment, you still aren't in a position, unless by other means, that you're able to afford the kind of care that, that we can now, only because I've been doing this for a few years longer. I think that is a big challenge. And I think as an institute at Dana-Farber, where it's run by a woman, Lori Glimcher is our CEO and president of Dana-Farber and is fiercely committed to the advancement of women in sciences and in medicine. And she and I have had numerous conversations, both on public panels as well as just one-on-one, about what are all the ways we can help continue to develop the support system so that more and more women can enter and, most importantly, stay in this workforce and progress and traverse that challenging time from trainee to laboratory leader or director or PI or so on. That's the transition that's the hardest. And I think that we need to still make significant progress to be able to attract and retain that talent.
Would you say that one, like academia compared to industry, since you got an experience in both, do you think one is maybe a bit more supportive than the other? It's
an interesting question. From academics to industry, there are situations in which I've seen it work both ways, actually. I think on the academic side, I would speak from where I hold my main position. The benefit comes in the flexibility. There is no boss, if you will, ahead of me. It really is my lab. I have to keep the lab running. I have a lot on my shoulders to make sure the lab runs. I have to make sure that everybody is progressing in their training and that they're all happy and that their work is coming along well. But in the end of the day, if tomorrow my child can't go to daycare because he or she is sick, I just cancel my day and nothing's going to happen to my career, most likely. So on that side, the flexibility is terrific. If I have to go and travel to see family or for other reasons, and I'm going to miss the entire next week, it's not going to ruin my career. I think in the industry side, the flexibility, comes from the fact that you're not pressured to have to get grants. You're not pressured on the metrics of papers and grants all the time as the metric of your success. You are measured, though, on how you drive forward programs. You are measured on that so that you can keep going up the ladder. But in the company setting, oftentimes a deliverable is a deliverable, and a deliverable must be delivered in the time frame that it was expected, because without that, oftentimes there are major consequences at each of the levels of the company, be it the higher ups of the company, the executive level, the board level, and we're all on these timelines to try to progress things to the market. And so, of course, in some cases there, I can see that presenting a challenge actually for the flexibility. So I think, again, both have their advantages and disadvantages. It depends on how you as an individual weigh those challenges and benefits. I think if you're one who is very stressed out about the act of getting grants and making sure trainees are happy and all of that, then that might be more of a challenge than it is an opportunity. And so the flexibility doesn't play it as much there. On the other hand, you may like the organization and the deadlines and everything of the company, but if you're too stressed by those deadlines, then it may also be challenging. So I think that really I can see it both ways. And we're actually in this very fortunate era right now. Even 10 years ago, and certainly 20 years ago, industry used to be the second best choice. If you can't make it in science and you can't make it as an academic professor, you go into industry. That's how it used to be viewed. Even when I started graduate school, it was still thought, especially by the older generation of professors, okay, well, if you didn't have your big paper, you're probably not going to become a PI.
It's definitely still that way.
And it can still be that way. Absolutely right. I think with the older generation, it's still, their metric is how many people have you put as an academic PI into the workforce, not as a company leader, no matter how great that person has been. It's all about how many PIs have you helped raise. And I think that there's a major change. It might not be everywhere, and it might not be at all institutions equally, but just given the idea, I mentioned there's 850 public biotech companies, there's many more private companies. And I can tell you, living in the other Cambridge, the Boston, Cambridge area, there are so many companies that are being created by the minute almost, and larger companies and companies that are well established, that there are such a plethora of opportunities for anybody emerging from graduate school or postdoctoral training, that the training, the training really facilitates their entry into any position they want. If they want to become an academic PI, they can. And if they don't want to, but they could have, they don't want to, they want to go and either start a company, be one of the first employees of a new company. I have several people in my lab that did that. Join a large pharma because they really want pharma experience because they're trying to ultimately become an executive of a company. All those opportunities exist. And so I think we're in a new era now in which there are so many opportunities that go well beyond the standard conventional academic training that we've all been trained, within that framework. And I think that that's great because there's so many different talents that people acquire throughout PhD and postdoctoral training. It's not only the technical mastery of a certain field and the ability to conceptually put out a new story. I think you also gain leadership opportunities, you gain mentoring opportunities, and so on and so forth, depending on what you did during that training. And so we're lucky. We're in a really prized time, I think, in biomedical, the whole biomedical science industry. The choice exists. There are so many choices, and there's a really major need for talented, budding scientists eager to contribute to the world in a diverse repertoire of ways.
To shift gears now towards the end, as a last question, is there any lesson you'd like to give, let's say, something that you learned during your life, maybe particular towards like students or anyone to kind of like either succeed or generally just in terms of life?
I think the top lesson is to believe in yourself. I had multiple moments where I probably could have not believed in myself, and it wouldn't have been a productive outcome for what we were trying to do. I also would say that there's a collection of voices we hear in our world. You have multiple mentors. That's another thing, actually, multiple mentors. I think oftentimes, again, in the more conventional, older-fashioned mentoring system, they say, identify your one mentor. Who is your mentor? And I've never really done that. I've always had a collection of mentors. And I think, again, that diversity of viewpoints is actually very helpful. It doesn't mean you need to take all of those voices, but I think just having at your fingertips, the access to those mentors, in times where perhaps hearing it from a few different perspectives would be useful is great. I think just remembering that your pursuit of your own dreams is really the most important for you. Nobody else can actually do that for you. Nobody else knows what you want quite as much as you do. And so just remember who you are when you're talking with anybody, a mentor, somebody who's put in there to help give you guidance, perhaps somebody who is there to criticize your work. Take with a grain of salt what you want. Take criticism in a productive way, but remember who you are and what you want, and believe in yourself.
Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you've had a good time, and I can't wait to see what you do next.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really been a pleasure to speak with both of you. And again, it's really an honor to be here today. So thank you.